I call Phil Twyford.
That speaker wasn't so much pedestrian as, well, actually, I think if he'd been any more comatose, he would have fallen over at his desk, Mr. Speaker. I want to correct one thing. I want to correct one thing that speaker said. He claimed that Jerry Brownlee was a farmer, and Jerry Brownlee, he's no farmer. He might be a grazer, but he's certainly no farmer, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Clayton Cosgrove. I want to talk about this government's housing policies because in the budget they made two announcements that are typical in so many ways of this government's housing policy. The first was Nick Smith's now infamous Crown land fiasco in Auckland, where he tried to flog off patches of land that the government doesn't even own, where he claimed that the local iwi had no rights of first refusal, and it turns out they actually did, and now he's in court defending the government's policy against legal action by Ngāti Whātua. And the second budget housing policy that the government announced was the so-called two-year test designed to catch a few property speculators. Having denied and denied and denied for the last 3 years that property speculators are even a problem in Auckland, flying in the face of all the evidence, the government denied that property speculation is a problem, and yet they announced in the budget the two-year test, which is basically an invitation to property speculators in Auckland to hold on to their properties for 2 years and a day and then flick them off. Why are this government's housing policies so token, so superficial and so ineffective? That's the question that everybody in Auckland is asking. Because basically this is the see no evil, hear no evil housing policy. And it's obvious, sir, that this government is in denial. They're complacent and in denial that there's a housing crisis in Auckland. The housing market in Auckland, sir, is obviously completely out of control. The average house price in Auckland in the last 12 months went up $135,000 by 18.8%. That's the average. And yet this government says there's no housing crisis. Generation rent are locked out of the housing market. It's obvious for anybody to see. It's impossible, except for young people who are born with a silver spoon in their mouth, to ever hope realistically of owning their own home in Auckland. We have a rise in homelessness across the city, people living in cars and garages and campgrounds, and ballooning inequality between the young and the old, between people who own property and people who are landless, and between people who live in Auckland and the rest of the country. You'd think that the government would be worried. You'd think they'd be worried. In fact, sir, it's hard to find anyone who thinks this isn't a major social and economic crisis in Auckland. The OECD have told us that Auckland housing is among the most overvalued in the world. The Reserve Bank have repeatedly cautioned this government and said that the Auckland housing crisis is a threat to financial stability. They embarrassed the government by saying that they hadn't done enough, that they needed to do more to increase supply and to deal with property speculation. Chris Parker, the chief economist at Auckland Council, said in the last few days that Auckland's housing market was not far away from being a bubble. And he cited independent research by NZIER that showed that Auckland's house prices were 1/3 overvalued compared to future rental incomes. 1/3 overvalued. Chris Parker of Auckland Council says we're not far away from it being a bubble. And then the final indignity for this government's housing policy, Standard & Poor's, the international credit rating agency, on Friday afternoon downgraded the credit rating of all the major banks in New Zealand, the 6 largest banks, citing the increased risks from Auckland's housing boom. They left its issuer credit ratings at AA-, but they lowered the standalone credit profiles by 1 notch for each of the 4 major banks. They said that the actions reflect our view that New Zealand financial institutions face heightened risks because of an increase in the country's overall level of economic imbalances over the past 3 years. In particular, we believe the rapid rise in house prices in Auckland during this period has amplified the risk of a sharp correction in the housing market. Standard & Poor's, one of the leading international credit agencies, they have said that the housing crisis in Auckland is posing a significant risk to our banking system. It's plain, sir. Everybody can see it. Aucklanders know what's going on, but why is this government in denial? Well, the answer was revealed inadvertently in an interview that the Prime Minister gave on News Talk ZB a week and a half ago, where he said that Aucklanders are happy because they're getting wealthier because their house prices are going up. It was the most candid this Prime Minister's been in the last few years about why they are a do-nothing government when it comes to housing policies. The Prime Minister revealed that he's comfortable with Auckland house prices going up on average $135,000 in the last 12 months. He's comfortable with that because he's made the cynical political calculation that he can harvest enough votes from homeowners watching their paper wealth increasing by the year, by the week, by the day, and he's willing to throw under the bus the more than half of all Aucklanders who actually live in rented accommodation, and a generation of young Aucklanders who, under this government's housing policies, face no prospect of ever owning their own home. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, it's that level of political cynicism by the National Party. That is why this Prime Minister has condemned a whole generation of young New Zealanders to being Generation Rent. In his words, they are becoming landless tenants in their own land. And this National Party is happy to stand by and watch that happen. That's why Nick Smith is the worst housing minister in living memory. He's the minister of photo ops, of stunts and grudging half measures. Nick Smith's Crown Land fiasco, where he promised 500 hectares of new land for housing development. Where is that now, Mr. Speaker? Where is that land? Where are the houses? Where are the thousands of houses that were promised in his special housing areas in Auckland? At last count, Mr. Speaker, the Auckland Council said 18 months after they announced the housing accord in Auckland, at last count, Auckland Council confirmed 300 houses. 300! Auckland needs 13,000 houses just to stand still, just to keep up with population growth. And yet, as the Productivity Commission pointed out, this government's pet think tank pointed out that at current build rates, Auckland is slipping behind by 5,000 houses every year. There's a shortfall of 32,000 houses at the moment in Auckland. That's one of the main reasons why house prices continue to go through the roof, that shortage. And yet under National, we're 5,000 short every year. The Productivity Commission predicted that by 2020, that 32,000 shortfall will have blown out to 60,000. The housing crisis is getting worse by the day in Auckland, and this government does nothing effective about it. They're in denial about the rampant property speculation that's driving house prices higher and higher. 45% of all property transactions in Auckland, according to QV, are to investors with multiple properties. And yet this government, the best they can do is the grudging half measure, that 2-year test that their own most respected tax advisor, John Shewan, said will do nothing to rein in house prices. It will do nothing to deter speculators. Sir, it's a housing crisis. It's having huge economic and social consequences for this country, but this government is out of touch with what people want, and they are refusing to listen to the demand of the public of New Zealand for serious action on the housing crisis.
The Honourable Judith Collins.
Speaker, I'd like to thank the member who's resumed his seat for reminding me